As a trans woman who covers weird, niche media that often has some sort of spooky bend, here's a question that I sometimes ask myself. Why do queer people like horror so much? What is it about art that scares and unsettles us which draws us so much to it, both as creatives and as intrigued listeners? For me, broadly, it's that horror as a genre often prides itself on pushing boundaries. They show things that are often unacceptable through cinematic, oral, and written language meant to touch the emotions of the audience deeply. Gut-wrenching brutality, heart-stopping thrills, and grotesque body horror to name a few things. Things which imply horrors and feelings beyond regular words that can only be aptly expressed through implications, abstractions, and visceral exaggerations. For people who have, for generations and still do, lived in fear of prosecution, harassment, and 1,000 other things, that can make horror a really good vessel to relay those fears back to them and to audiences who might not otherwise have any concept of it. And particularly as a trans person, I love it for how it can explore gender identity, especially in more extreme subgenres. Sure, seeing a character get chopped up and put back together in a Guro story or morphing in horrifying ways in a body horror story isn't always meant to represent dysphoria or social rejection specifically, but it sure does feel a hell of a lot like it. So when I hear about a piece of unyieldingly bloody horror media that openly embraces queer themes and explores them in those visceral, brutal, yet relatable ways, I can't help but get a little curious. And that is exactly what happened almost a year ago with Dasaku. Released in 2014 by CYCLET as sister brand to queer powerhouse and channel favorite Black Psych, it was marketed on its brutality as an Eroguro title and saw some fairly good success for that, narrowly hitting the top 20 overall in Getchu's rankings for the month of release. And since then has garnered a reputation mainly for two things. One, being disgustingly brutal and gory, and two, that it's one of the few visual novels, period, that features explicitly trans characters. Dasaku is a work that sets itself up as bizarre from the outset, with a name translating to something like shoddy work or worthless art, and at first glance to an outsider it might seem just like that, a trashy nukige with a hyper-violent sexploitation B-movie bend to it. And while people who aren't into darker horror works might shrug it off as that, those of you who are probably have your ears perking up in curiosity. It's precisely because it's such an unyieldingly grotesque and cruel work that it's able to do everything it wants to do, to explore the chaotic ways in which queer people have to navigate their lives in society, the ways in which people's flaws can interact with that, and how all of us are capable of becoming monsters because of society, yet that doesn't mean we aren't still humans. And in those regards, I think Dasaku is not just a staggering monument to people's desire to see toxic yuri where women of all strides do fucked up and horrible things to each other, but may also be one of the most impactful stories I've read. It's one of the few I've seen that's willing to take things like gender essentialist ideas to their utmost extreme to ridicule them, show the complex and painful struggles that come with being a trans woman, and even look at more broadly understandable struggles like desires for vengeance and punishment. Make no mistake, this is not a game that can be easily recommended except to those of a strong stomach and an interest in bizarre art, but if you're in the same kind of boat that I am, of someone who loves these kinds of brutal and blunt explorations of society, identity, and what it means to be on the outskirts of social norms, then I invite you to take a seat and learn about one of 2014's most interesting pieces of untranslated, gory, weird art, and one that's sure to shock as much as it is to provoke thought. Set in modern-day Japan, Dasaku follows the perspective of one Yuki Haiki, a high school student who lives an average life with his small group of friends. The fashionable trans girl Toboso Aoya, the ditzy and cute Somari Takawai, the bashful Hanami Rindo, and the kind Alice Nakaki. Everything seems wonderful for a time, a perfect group of friends who even wish upon a falling star to always stay together. Things quickly begin to fall apart after Alice reveals a secret to them. There's a stalker after her. Yuki is chosen as the one to protect her and stay by her side, which seems to keep her safe until she's attacked one fateful evening, forced to defend herself and wound the stalker until Yuki is able to come later to check on her. Romantic sparks fly between the two, culminating in a night where Alice comes into his place unprompted, only for her to see him out of the shower half naked with a wound exactly like the one she gave to the stalker, thus revealing that Yuki is the same person as him, and summarily beginning a chain of events where he brutalizes each and every one of the heroines, carving parts for each of their body to put together a perfect lover to live with in a perfect pure world. The motives for this are revealed through flashbacks interspersed throughout all of the chaos. The reality is, Yuki isn't a man, but rather an intersex woman with two sets of genitals, born to an abusive mother who left her for dirt at an orphanage. She pretends to be a cis man in hopes of being accepted by the only person who showed her love there and in her entire life, Alice, but as proven by this opening route, that's simply not possible. Alice, bizarrely, was not most upset by her lover being a stalker, but rather seeing her naked and seeing that she's intersex, someone abnormal and therefore in her mind, a monster. Which then begs the question, even if Yuki were to do nothing wrong, is there any hope for somebody abnormal like her to be happy in this world? Or for anyone in the friend group for that matter, all of whom have faced painful lives and harbor destructive, dark desires? Or are they all destined to be isolated from the world, branded as monsters destroying themselves and each other in any given future, no matter how innocent or sinful they are? If it's not already clear, Dasaku is a very odd game, and that extends to the structure of the plot. The actual common route of the game lasts a whopping 30 minutes before you're railroaded onto Yuki's stalker route, and after you've cleared that, a new series of choices become available within the first 15 minutes or so of content, leading to 4 unique heroine routes that also showcase them falling into depravity. Because of how the story is segmented though, all of that stuff I just mentioned about the group killing and the stalking doesn't really make sense until you've seen the rest of the game. As it stands now, it's more or less a way for Dasaku to introduce some plot dilemmas and core aspects of Yuki's backstory, allowing the other routes to be more focused and pointed on each of the heroines' own fall into madness. To its credit, it does a damn good job at that. There's a lot of subtle and not so subtle details that tease where each route in the game is headed thematically, so it doesn't feel entirely disconnected from the rest of the title. But there is still a bit of whiplash going from it to the other routes, particularly in how Stalker Yuki is so different from normal Yuki. As a protagonist, she's someone that I think anyone who feels pressured by society to fit in will find relatable. About 3/4 of the game follows her perspective, and the ways in which she muses on her struggles with identity and acceptance, and the way society treats gender non-conforming people, are just as interesting as how she goes about conceptualizing her otherwise typical day-to-day life. This is to say nothing about the complexity of her identity as well, and just how well it's portrayed. Yuki does wholly identify as a woman, and simply wants to be able to be seen as one despite having both parts. But she also wishes to fit in and be capable of receiving love for other women, seeing it best to mask as a man to achieve that, complete with wearing a binder to hide her chest. Though I do have to at least mention that her specific intersex condition of having both parts fully functioning is literally impossible to occur due to how genitals form on a physiological level. While I can see some viewers sighing at the missed opportunity to portray someone with a medically existing intersex condition, of which is incredibly rare in media, and instead going for what may be seen as a stereotypical conception of intersexuality, I don't think the choice for Yuki to be like this was done out of ignorance or even without purposefulness. The story on a meta level is very well aware that Yuki's body is something that cannot exist despite being an ideal for some, and uses that to commentate on the complex desires of people outside of the gender binary. And despite the unrealistic nature of her specific condition, I think her struggles are generalized enough that anybody who suffered from dysphoria, a need to mask, or any other number of issues caused by not fitting into the cis-binary will find her relatable. Particularly, I found her stress she endured with, for lack of a better term, boy moding, incredibly similar to how I felt prior to coming out and getting medical treatment. And the game doesn't at all shy away from how rewarding yet also dangerous it can be to be open and honest about your sexual and gender identity, especially when you don't know how the people close to you might take it. The game also leverages her identity as a way to talk about what it feels like to be an outcast in general, and shows her as someone who's exceptionally loving and accepting because of this once you're past the opening, almost to a fault with how she's willing to accept an immense amount of abuse, being willing to do and accept very terrible things in the name of love. It also makes for a fascinating contrast with how half the heroines are similarly good, accepting people deep down, and the other half aren't that. But all of them are equally prone to flying off the rails due to immaturity and character flaws, and it does not take long for those guardrails to get knocked out into the atmosphere, never to be seen again amongst a sea of crimson red blood and incredibly unwell girlfriends. Out of all of them, Toboso has to be my personal favorite for how relatably her route deals with struggles of dysphoria and the pains caused by gender essentialism. But I think each of them have their own strengths and each go into sufficiently different territories so as not to overlap, the game even shifting perspective away from Yuki to each heroine to flesh them out rather often. Similar to what I talked about in my video on Cross-Channel, Dasaku is a game that aims to take what at first seem like anime character archetypes and flesh them out into full-blown people. Which, frankly, the fact this game even pulls that bait-and switch of a rather tame opening hour going into an off-the-rails main portion is a bit odd in an abstract sense. Dasaku was never marketed on any idea of subversion. You can openly find the game priding itself on how it indulges in bloody, gory brutality on any given storefront, yet it still seeks to try and deceive the player. But as I'll explore more later, Dasaku is at least partly about the ways in which even seemingly normal, desirable people can be actual horrifying monsters just as much as people who appear outwardly not to fit in society, and that so-called monsters are not undeserving of finding love, a good future, or healing. So it does actually make sense the game would go this route. But I bring it up anyways because I was sold on the game as being an Eroguro title and then got confused by the tame opening hour. And I've also seen the inverse. A lot of Japanese second language players seem to get thrown off by it starting normal then suddenly turning into a commentary on gender essentialism by the way of skull fucking. Dasaku is a game that, once you get past the beginning bits, lays out all of its themes clearly, of the oppressed becoming oppressors, of disability and ableism, of gender and medicalization, and of how society treats treats the abnormal, and how the normal are often abnormal themselves. Any single one of those is a tall order to try and handle, but the fact the game aims to try and do something fulfilled and meaningful with each of them, with only 2 hours to spend on each route no less, is a very admirable goal that's well achieved. Something that bears some mention though is the lack of any standardized order for said routes. The order I did was Alice, Hanami, Somari, and Toboso, but that may or may not be the most sound given that Alice's route is both different execution from the rest of the game and leads into the fan disc. I've seen some people argue for Hanami, Somari, Toboso, and Alice, which may make more sense, but Toboso's is also doubtlessly the best, so it is what it is. It at least doesn't change the fact that the actual contents of each route are fantastic. One of Dasaku's advertising taglines was "of monsters, by monsters, for monsters," which feels very apt. It's a game exploring people capable of very horrible things by a company known for making grotesque and B-movie exploitative works, and it's for people into weird, squicky, hardcore games that explores concepts to an extent only fiction can achieve. And I would argue the game being a Nukige actually benefits the kind of narrative it wants to go into. But I think it being in that very sexually driven form, one which generally wants text that isn't too dense so as to keep the player in the action, explains the aforementioned bluntness with its themes. That isn't to say it lacks depth, however. Conversely, Dasaku is a game with a lot of meat on its bones and details to find and think on across subsequent playthroughs, with a lot of themes not wholly answered so as to allow the viewer to extrapolate on them. That speaks to Maruo's impressive talents as a writer just as much as the quality of the dialogue and prose does. They're able to write each character with a very distinct way of speaking that reflects their personalities both on a surface and deep level, and rereading the opening segments shows a lot of effort was put into making all of the quirks of each character clear long before they start cutting each other open. The prose as well surprised me with how rich it could be with detail. I've seen Dasaku touted as a game that's approachable for newcomers learning Japanese, and assumed it would use very simple language because of that. And certainly it does. Outside of some medical terms, you're not really going to find much here that one can't push their way through with a basic vocabulary and knowledge of grammar. But I was wrong in also assuming that the prose would be plain, because Maruo still manages to craft monologues full of meaning and visceral detail because of their simplicity. Simple yet effective expressions, rhythmic and flowing sentences that often mirror each other, vivid and evocative descriptions, and some appreciable subtlety in grammar and language used, all makes for a title that never stops being entertaining to read. I feel Dasaku also deserves some respect for just how well it manages to handle almost all of its mental health and gender topics, despite being a game released in 2014. That said, I have to address the very odd way dissociative identity disorder is used here. It's weirdly complicated and frankly might not actually be a problem at all. The opening route narrative has a flashback showing Yuki being diagnosed with it as an infant, as an explanation for how she changes between being a stalker and a normal person without remembering anything. Except it's very clearly shown moments later that she does remember everything, and even in her normal state is fine with having killed and maimed people. So like, my take is that Yuki does not in fact have DID and that the doctor is performing medical malpractice, because events of that route go counter to the ideas presented, and it literally does not come up in the rest of the whole game, and also you cannot diagnose an infant with DID, that is not how that works. Did Maruo intend this to be a kind of commentary on the failures of the medical system, or did they really truly have a poor conception of what DID is and wrote a half-baked plot point that came straight out of a crappy 80s B-movie slasher flick? I don't know, I can't say for sure, but I have to lean in on the former both based on what I know of his later work's themes, and for how this game is otherwise highly critical of social structures and medical institutions. Regardless of this all, Dasaku does work well on the whole, and that includes how it utilizes adult content within its narrative. This is one of those games that fits very cleanly into the term Nukige, and with exception to the first hour or so of Alice's route, the game is a non-stop barrage of sex scenes that are ostensibly meant to be erotic. But within most of those is an impressive amount of thematic meaning and exploration of the depths in which people can be brought to when society rejects and destroys them. I always jokingly introduce the game to equally sicko friends of mine as a game with skull fucking as a metaphor for the absurdity of gender essentialism, and while that does sound absurd on its surface, I think it really does work out well in the context of the game. Dasaku is a title that I think very much embodies Gudo's possibility to explore emotions and feelings in a brutal, abstract way that can't be done through many other means. There's a quote I like from an article in the Daily Dot about the subject, which goes as follows. For me, Gudo marries a sense of nihilism with a traditional take on what's erotic. There's something that's almost a fuck you to the idea of conceptions of desirability when you team it with scenarios that portray an almost joyful disrespect for the boundaries of what bodies can physically do, and what's morally right. Fitting for a game about people undesirable in society, Dasaku shows some truly undesirable acts to show the depths, both sadistic and masochistic, to which people will go in order to feel some degree of satisfaction. Beating, cutting, choking, stabbing, electrocuting, dismembering, pretty much anything you can imagine here is done here, and done for reasons both out of love and cruelty. I also have to admire the sheer creativity of many of the scenarios present. After all, how many other games are gonna have a hardcore sadistic femdom turf topping a girl with a dick and bullying her for having one, or a trans girl who makes a hole where her womb would be so her girlfriend could getting into there while she, or of the time that All of this is woven well into the story too, as I just mentioned, without ever disrupting the pacing, which makes sense given the erotica is basically the story. Dasaku is a very tightly put together game with most everything having a purpose by the end in its 8 to 12 or so hour long narrative. No scenes go on for too long or too little time, making for a game that flies by as long as you're able to bear through what it shows you. Which, I get that's a tall ask for most people given the extremeness of the subject matter, so I don't blame anyone for not being able to handle the game. But if you can, then the game has a hell of a lot to offer thematically and maybe even erotically if you're into this sort of material, which includes some very well illustrated art. Dasaku was illustrated by Rei Gitsune, known for pretty much nothing except this game, as their only other credit is for a lesser-known title, also by CYCLET, Fukushu no Necromancer. A bit of a shame as I personally adore how this game looks. It very much captures a 2010 moe art style of big soft eyes, expressive faces, cutesy designs, but with less refinement and perfection than something like a Yuzusoft title. I also have to mention that the characters in this game have some serious drip, especially if they're casual wear. Toboso's wild pastel dresses and frilly accessories, Alice's more conservative yet still stylish get-ups, Hanami's look that's somewhere between Gyaru and tomboy, Yuki's outfit that's trying way too hard to boy mode but also not hard enough. It's all very memorable and goes a long way towards making each character feel distinct. As well as that, the sheer amount of CGs the game has is respectable. It's kind of expected from a Nukige, given that the genre as a whole tends on leaning towards shorter titles packed with content, but I still find it admirable how all of them are incredibly well illustrated, even including cut-ins for additional details and dynamism. I am also particularly fond of how the coloring looks here. The game generally opts for a softer look that's quite easy on the eyes, especially compared to the often rather grim subject matter, regularly accompanied by some rather striking shading and lighting shown in some of Alice's and Toboso's CGs. It's nothing mind-bogglingly great, but nonetheless makes for an aesthetically pleasing game, doubly so when played on display with well-defined colors. I should also note that there's two distinct versions of the Dasaku release, the original game from late 2014 and a re-release titled newly Ableism from very early 2016, which bumps the game up from 4 free aspect ratio at 800x600 to true widescreen 69 at 1280x720. And it's not just a simple pan and scan job either. Everything from backgrounds to CGs were properly expanded and reframed to take advantage of the format. The CGs themselves don't seem to be redrawn from scratch or anything, the shared segments of the art match up one-to-one, so there's no reason to play the original version of the game anymore unless you want to play on an older computer or with an older display. Which, I mean, hey, the coloring here looks fantastic on a CRT, so I don't blame you. Both these versions of the game also run on the same system NNN engine, which powers most titles from Black Psych. While I've discussed it a fair amount before on this channel, it bears repeating that it's robust and will run fine on computers dating back to the early 2000s or even the late 90s. The only real downside to it is that it's not quite as scalable in terms of accessibility options as something like Giga's Nexus engine, only offering the kind of basic features you expect from any VN nowadays. Where Dasaku does start to falter a bit visually is in the backgrounds. If you've been watching this channel for a while or are familiar with other games funded by CYCLET parent company Ramba Amuse, you might have noticed that some of them are familiar. And that's because their smaller titles like this tend to pull from a library of stock assets they have available, which includes the scenery. During my time playing, I recognized at least 2 or 3 that were also in the previously reviewed Gore Screaming show from 2006, and I'm sure some viewers who are fans of their titles are recognizing others. It's not a bad thing, I think, but it is kind of jarring to see something I associate with the Funny Clown Man game come up here, though I guess you could take it as proof of the extended Psych canon. The problem with asset reuse, unfortunately, extends out to the music. Dasaku's score is, only with exception to the ending theme as far as I know, stock Ramba Amuse music, and it has a notably detrimental impact on the atmosphere of the game. Some tracks are fine, while others feel like they were chosen because they just vaguely matched the atmosphere and nothing else was available to them. There's also a feeling of really inconsistent production quality across the whole score. Some tracks are very professionally produced and modern, while others seem like they were made in the early 2000s with a bunch of old synthesizers. I would know because I make a ton of music that way professionally, and there's nothing wrong with that, but man does it stand out. The aural textures do not mesh. The only positive that this stock music approach brings is allowing for a much greater variety of tracks than if they had to pay a composer for each individual one. Much as I feel the quality is inconsistent and the usage is also less than stellar sometimes, there's never any sort of feeling of deja vu with one composition being played too often, and the scripting team did a good job placing them throughout the experience. Much as I have my gripes, I do get why it's like this. On a corporate level, Dasaku is just a Guro Nukige, a title that exists to appeal to a specific audience that, while I'm sure many care about these as works of art, probably don't care care about a full original score or perfectly brand new assets. But I still can't help but feel this cost-cutting measure took away a chance for the game to have a more defined oral identity. And for a game that is otherwise as unique and stand out like nothing else as this game is, that's kind of a shame. At the very least, CYCLET did manage to bring on a good cast of voice actors. Nakamura Asumi as Hanami, Kitamura Aya as Alice, Kondo Yuki as Toboso all do a solid job reprising their roles and dealing with some incredibly extreme subject matter. Well, they even got Yuki voiced in one of the rare instances of a fully voiced eroge protag. It's definitely one of the game's strongest points among many, the rest of which I'll now finally be diving into with the spoiler segment. If you want to go into the game knowing as little as possible beyond what I've already said, then I recommend skipping ahead to my concluding thoughts. But first, a little break to thank all the donors and sponsors that make this possible, and some shoutouts to people that you should check out. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Patreon segment, that time of the video to give life updates, channel updates, shoutouts, and thank the donors and sponsors that make all of this possible. For this time around, well, the big deal is that Patreon restructured a bit, to put it lightly, and I've had to adjust my Patreon accordingly. They seem to be forcing users to create pledge tiers to lock content behind, rather than broadly locking it behind someone paying any amount they choose, so I've also had to make pledge tiers. That said, no content is locked behind any particular tiers. All the ones I have are just options for how much you want to donate a month to get around the frankly nonsense system they devised where custom pledges seem to be worthless now. So if you're new to the channel and interested in donating, pick whatever is best for you. And if you're already a patron and didn't see the update I posted, you'll probably have to select a tier to keep seeing exclusive content, and I'm so damn sorry for the inconvenience. As always though, I'm incredibly grateful for all the support that people have shown, even more so now that I have to make people do inconvenient adjustments to compensate for the end-shitification of a platform. Y'all are cool as hell, and I can't thank each and every one of you who chooses to donate enough. Again, like always, I'm just continually astounded at the fact that I can make a living wage off of creating this content, and I'm more appreciative than I could ever put into words. Thank you all so much. And in my ongoing effort to give back to the community that makes this possible, I'd like to shout out a couple of people from a Twitter thread I made asking for creators to talk about what they're making. Not just videos, but games, music, art, and so on. So if you'd like to potentially be featured in a future video, then drop a reply to that post or send me an ask on Tumblr. I am always looking for new stuff to give due attention to. The first person I want to shout out is Fusozide, who I first learned out about through her Tech Product Bangers account, which, for the record, is still one of the best accounts on Twitter and well worth following if you love cool old ringtones and demo songs from keyboards. But what I want to focus on today is her own musical endeavors, in particular, her album, The Dynamically Generated Future. I sometimes point out in my videos the difficulty of defining genre as it pertains to stories, and I think this album is a really good example of that same thing in music form, in a very good way. While overarchingly electronic, the sheer variety of styles incorporated into it throughout the album and the many different places it goes, from fast-paced drum and bass to slower ambient tracks of all different eras, shows a really impressive musical vocabulary. It's finely produced, eclectic yet cohesive, and all in all a blast to listen to. So if you got a couple bucks to spare on a new album, then definitely throw them her way and enjoy some cool tunes, and check out the rest of the stuff while you're at it. The second person I'd like to shout out is Milia's Game Room, another channel primarily covering Japanese games, albeit way more broadly. They've got some videos on visual novels like White Album, which I really enjoyed the bit of I saw, but the one I was most impressed by was their 15-minute retrospective on Ruby Party. Longtime channel viewers may recognize that name as a developer of Angelique, the first Ultimate game, and as someone fascinated by their history, I was hooked by this video. Milia's editing is simple but effective, her voiceover is pleasant to listen to, her research is solid, and it's just an overall great peek at an important part of Japanese gaming history. So if you're at all curious about Ultimate games, I'd really recommend checking it out. Even if you're not, it's still a great time. Okay, before we move on to some questions and closing notes, and with those two hopefully in another tab to look at after the vid, I'd like to take a moment to shout out one more thing, and that's the sponsor of this video, Very OK Vinyl. If you haven't seen my previous videos shouting them out, they're a small company out of Ontario, Canada, publishing vinyl soundtracks of games like Sayano Uta and Rusty, or most recently on pre-order, Steins Gate and Cotton. As a huge fan of shoot-em-ups and a lover of the Cotton series, no matter how much I suck at it, I'm incredibly excited for that upcoming release. And if past releases I own are anything to go by, it's gonna be a treat. They feature very well mastered sound that's a joy to listen to, high quality artwork and packaging that's fun to display and look through, and many releases even come with funky looking special edition discs that are only available for a very short time. So if you'd like to get your hands on either of those soundtracks while they're on pre-order, then head on over to veryokvinyl.com and secure your copy today. And while you're there, check out the soundtracks they sell from other brands too, like Bloodborne, Cowboy Bebop, and Overlord. There's many more to come too, thanks to new partnerships like one with Japanese record store Disc Union. So thanks again to Very OK Vinyl for sponsoring the show as always, and for continuing to release records of cool Japanese media. Okay, before we wrap up, I got a couple of questions from patrons to rapid fire since this is already a bit long, but I don't want to leave people hanging. Let's go. M. Suspiriorum asked, would there be interest in covering Shingakko? Yeah, absolutely. As mentioned in the comment, it's another game that Gunkatana's writer worked on, and it's one that I've had recommended to me many times. Poppin' Up asked, have you ever heard of Sharon, game dev? I have not until now, but looking at their VNDB, they seem to be a really fascinating and blunt indie dev who's still at it. So maybe I'll take a peek in the future? Mayaya asked, have you covered an Ultimate game on the channel yet? I highly recommend Jack Jean. It's beautiful in both art and writing. I did cover Angelique ages ago, but I'm not sure how much that counts. That said, if I do cover an Ultimate game, Jack Jean is certainly high up on the list, as is Chonotoku. And with that, we are just about wrapped up here. Again, I want to thank everyone who makes this content possible, and if you'd like to support me directly like all the cool people on the side of the screen, consider tossing $1 or more monthly on Patreon or on Ko-fi, the latter of which supports one-time donations. In exchange, you'll get access to videos without censors, oftentimes early access, the ability to ask me questions for videos, see a list of games to cover, status updates, your name in the segment, and other cool stuff like a fuzzy nice feeling in your heart. I can't guarantee that last one though. The minimum per Patreon policy is just a single US dollar, and there's tiers for 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 50, 10, and 20 as well, but you can do more money or weirder amounts on Ko-fi and you get the same benefits either way. And if you don't want to or don't have the money to donate, that's fine too. Just liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing, and all that other cool stuff helps to make these videos possible. I'm just thankful for any sort of support people choose to give. Videos are a collaborative effort, and without y'all's collaboration in all forms, I wouldn't be able to make them. So again, thank you everyone so much for your generosity and kindness, from the donors, to the sponsors, to the viewers, and let's get back to the show. As previously mentioned, Dasaku is split up between 4 routes, one for each heroine, and as Alice's is the first that I personally end up playing, I feel it's fitting to start there regardless of how it differs in execution from the rest. Because unlike all the other character routes, this one actually takes a while to get into any sort of sexual action. Yuki and Alice mutually realize they have crushes on each other, confess and go out, but Yuki stays apprehensive to show her body to and have sex with Alice for fear of judgment. While this leads Alice to mask her frustration, unable to understand why the lover she's thoroughly obsessed with would be unwilling to jump into things, Yuki's fears are reaffirmed when she meets a mysterious stranger one day by the name of Chloe. She claims to be Alice's younger sister who lives abroad of her parents following a certain incident at the household. Said incident explains the emotional foundation that the rest of this route works off of. Chloe was born without an arm and a leg and subsequently became the focus of the household as her parents attempted to cater to her needs, leaving Alice in the dust. That resentment over being given no attention led to her regularly beating Chloe in frustration, eventually boiling over into an incident where she spilled scalding water on her face, scarring her, leaving her half-blind and resulting in Alice being sent off to the same institutional orphanage as Yuki. Because of this, she grew up to hate people she sees as abnormal, at least partly because of how they steal attention away from her. And for Chloe, someone who grew up being loved, she sees affection from abled and otherwise normal people as looking down upon her. Unless that affection is coming from someone like her, a monster in her own words, then the only time people really see her as a person is when they hate her like Alice does. It's some pretty biting commentary on the visibility of disabilities. Chloe's being visible resulted in her seemingly being infantilized. People view her as an inferior being incapable of functioning on her own, and subsequently, it's impossible for her to take the affection of people sincerely. A view that stuck out to me as someone who's done at least a functional amount of reading into disability politics. People can, both consciously and subconsciously, treat those with disabilities as if they're unable to function on their own in a lot of different ways. They see the way that abled people live as the default and the only acceptable way to live. They see disabled people as lesser in society and aim to hide them, and of course, they attempt to coddle them due to an assumed inferiority. Though Chloe is wrong in believing that everyone is dehumanizing her, she certainly isn't wrong that many people in her life have shown her shallow pity that treats her more as something to gawk at. It is much easier to smother a person with infantilizing affection than to try and change the social environments that make disability exist as a concept in the first place. This route also seeks to touch on another side of ableism, that of people struggling to see mental health problems. Alice's issues, by virtue of being only in her mind, went completely ignored and only noticed when they reach an absolute boiling point, and the response to that was just to send her off to an orphanage, one which did nothing to heal her but frankly made her even worse. This route recontextualizes her reaching out to Yuki at the orphanage not as kindness, but as her trying to get attention from an ignored child. Even if what she did to Chloe was cruel and undeserved, so is neglecting your kid and shipping them off. It's because of this lack of care that Alice began to see people who are physically different, disabled or otherwise, as monsters, stealing away from her precious attention, while she herself completely ignores her own flaws. That primarily being, besides her ableism, an unhealthy desire for attention. Nothing matters to her more than people doting on her and acknowledging her, and she'll go as far as manipulating and abusing others to obtain it, as well as discarding them when she feels them to be no longer of value. This is exactly what Chloe attempts to warn Yuki about. Chloe was able to tell that Yuki was hiding her true identity just from a photograph of her friends that Alice sent to her parents, and advises that Alice will scorn and abandon her the moment it's revealed. Sure enough, exactly that comes true. Chloe arrives at Yuki's place to restrain, undress, and molest her that night before Alice arrives, and when she does, her anger towards Chloe's acts very quickly fade in favor of utter disgust at Yuki's being intersex. Chloe was correct. Alice really does lose all interest and care for people the moment they appear defective in her eyes. The incident leads her to run off, frustrated as always at Chloe for taking attention away from her, the fact her former lover just got molested be damned, and frustrated at Yuki for being a so-called monster, one that took her own attention and love. But she doesn't stay blind to her own failures for long, as Chloe shows up to confront her and make her realize she's just as broken as she is. Accepting this, Alice decides to do to herself what had been done to Chloe and what Chloe had been born with. Chopping an opposite arm and leg off and scarring the opposite side of her face, she finally finds herself able to embrace her monstrous nature as a whole, both mentally and physically, thus allowing her to accept the twisted love of her sister and the pure love which Yuki offers. It's a weird, bloody, brutal, and symbolic ending. Alice damages her own body as literal, physical proof of her deviation from society, unable to accept her mental instability alone as proof of it, and Chloe becomes reattached to Alice in a very toxic dynamic, the former inciting hatred in the latter, who gladly engages in it. It's also an excellent example of what Dasaku aims to do with all of its endings. This is a game that really embodies the idea of, I don't want to fix her, I want to make her worse! Maruo seems to have no interest in redeeming the characters they write here, but rather using them to show how institutions and ableist ideas destroy people through ones who've embodied them to their extremes. Alice is blind to her own issues for a lack of visibility and instead embraces them. Chloe is a hateful person incapable of accepting love because of an ableist society, and every other heroine is equally as much of a mess by their endings. That includes Somari, one which I've seen people half-jokingly refer to as a turf root, a description which is not at all inaccurate, and I'm going to give an additional content warning for this segment because this root, in order to criticize these things, showcases some incredibly disgusting transphobia, misandry, and just a general vitriolic hatred of anyone that isn't a perfectly normal cis woman. From the very beginning of the game, it's clear that she's going to take on somewhat of an antagonist role. She's almost proactive in trying to misgender Toboso, constantly calling her a cross-dressing man and refusing to see her as a woman for even a split second. That, however, doesn't seem to deter Yuki from falling in love with her and soon after revealing her true identity. While she seems to take it well to her face, she leaves Yuki's home internally outraged over being betrayed and goes straight to snitch about it to Hanami in order to make everyone cut ties with Yuki, which goes poorly for her as Hanami instead criticizes Somari for being horrible to Yuki and threatens to steal her away from her if she hurts her. All of that is salt in the wound for Somari, not only feeling disgusted by someone like Yuki existing, but feeling betrayed by her friends just like she was back in middle school, being assaulted by a group of cruel and sadistic boys, calling for help from her friend Kana, only for her to be scared off by the boys and leaving Somari for dirt. With all of this together, Somari decides to take all of her frustration out on Yuki. In her mind, anyone with a penis, man, intersex woman, non-op trans woman, etc., are all inherently rapists who secretly desire to assault cis women purely for their pleasure, and so she has every right to abuse Yuki, if it even qualifies as abuse. After all, if they're creatures, monsters driven by genitals, then genitals feeling good must override any feeling of pain they experience from that violation, right? Obviously, no. Her entire belief system is pretty clearly inspired by rad femme beliefs dating back to the 1970s, such as one presented in books like The Transsexual Empire by Janice Raymond and The Scum Manifesto by Valerie Solanas, the latter of which I feel has a paragraph which sums up many of Somari's views. And I quote directly, "The male is completely egocentric, trapped inside himself, incapable of empathizing or identifying with others or love, friendship, affection, or tenderness. He is a completely isolated unit, incapable of rapport with anyone. His responses are entirely visceral, not cerebral. His intelligence is a mere tool in the services of his drives and needs. He is incapable of mental passion, mental interaction. He can't relate to anything other than his own physical sensations." Jesus fucking Christ. This disgustingly horrible and misandrous belief more or less summarizes Somari's ideology. Men are worthless creatures that seek only to destroy others for their own pleasure and cannot feel anything else. Everything they do is in service of destroying women. They are all innately destructive monsters driven by phallic desires, and pure cis women are the superior, innocent people, victims of a hypersexual patriarchy. To be sympathetic, I'll be not at all exclusive to her. It's not as if this ideology is based on nothing. Her past experiences with men were incredibly traumatic and utterly unforgivable, her friend ditching her sad and horrifying, and the eventual admission by those men that what they did to her, assaulting, beating, everything, was just because they liked seeing her feeling horrible, is atrocious. That kind of soul-crushing horror is what can lead people to adopt these kinds of destructive ideologies, because on the surface, they seem to explain everything and allow one to run from their own issues. Trans-exclusionary radical feminism seeks to make simple the complexities of patriarchy and gender. Cis women are the only real women, anyone assigned male at birth is an agent of the patriarchy, and anyone part of the patriarchy is an enemy working to destroy women. Like all hateful extremist ideologies, it gives people a place to direct their hate and a justification to indulge in it, and simplify very complicated ideas into simple forms, without really examining societal structures and how they themselves might be capable of perpetuating them. Toboso's route goes more into how strict conceptions of gender can lead to self-destruction for those living outside of the binary, but Somari's route is focused on dealing more with the destruction of others. Her ideology allows her to mentally justify destroying Yuki, to use her to gain control over the life that was taken from her by the people who hurt her. After all, Yuki is not a person in her mind. She is a monster, a sexually destructive monster. It leads her to completely defile Yuki, and eventually buy a strap-on to achieve some facsimile of the level of power she believes men innately hold over women. An imperfect facsimile, but enough for her to proclaim that the old, weak, submissive Somari is dead, born in its place one capable of taking what she desires. But it's there, with her very last time with Yuki assaulting her on the school rooftops, that Hanami stumbles into the two and realizes Somari's true nature as a sadistic, hate-filled person, and that Somari's true intentions are revealed. The person she really loves is Hanami, and Yuki's been nothing but a nuisance getting in the way of that, what with Hanami's one-sided affection to her. So she sought to try and make Hanami hate Yuki, and failing that, to destroy Yuki and take all her rage out on her, eliminating any obstacle between their love. Having proven to herself capable of destroying people though, she assaults Hanami with the strap-on and realizes that she too, as a cis woman, is no less capable of taking joy in overpowering and ruining someone despite being born with different parts. And in the same vein, no less vulnerable to facing consequences, as Hanami pushes her away through the rusted fence, and to her death. Somari, by falling into these beliefs, completely fails to see until the very end of her life that power and abuse are not exclusive to a single gender identity or to a single type of genital. She's not wrong that, going purely by strict legal definitions, only people with a penis are capable of rape, but she's wrong in believing that other forms of sexual assault she can commit are any less horrifying and traumatic, and she's certainly wrong in assuming that just because the body is excited that the acts are actually anything short of scarring. It takes until the very, very end of her route for her to realize that she is exactly what she claims to hate about men. She is egocentric, trapped inside herself, incapable of empathizing or identifying with others, or with kind love, friendship, affection, or tenderness. Her responses are entirely visceral, built on trauma and hate. Her intelligence, a mere tool in service of achieving power over others. The most depressing thing about the hateful ideology that justifies this, and really extremist beliefs in general, is how many of them target vulnerable people like her. Her route, by going to the extreme lengths it does, shows what can happen when someone traumatized or weary of the world is given destructive, hateful ways to cope with it in their abuse. Simple ideas that justify awful things and make the world seem understandable. And speaking as someone who has been groomed and molested, someone who has felt complicated things over the legal definition of what rape is and the severity of the emotions I experience from what is considered a lesser offense, I legitimately get having that level of hatred, pain, and confusion. I understand wanting something to lash out at, something that can explain away the pit in your stomach left by people exploiting you at your most vulnerable, and wanting some way to gain control over your life. But directing that pain towards hurting other people and justifying the hurt of other people in any capacity, be it from sexual to ideological, just perpetuates harm. Healing and growth requires a caring community, self-reflection, and acceptance that not only are you capable of harm, but that more harm will not erase your own. Somari could have had those things, and found people that could have kept her together, but instead, like so many others, she fell down a rabbit hole of hatred, one that eventually led to a painful, unfortunate death. Unfortunately, it's not as if the other two characters meet much of a better end on a physical level, but at least on an emotional level they seem much less troubled by the end. Such is the case of Hanami's fruit, which deals with the immense guilt that can come from having hurt someone, and subsequently a desire for punishment which can go as far as seeking death. It starts with Yuki finding her out on the rooftops where she's seen alone, thinking. Each discussion involves some dialogue about morality, punishment, and pacifism, the two connecting on a mutual belief that no one deserves to be hated or purposefully hurt, an ideal that Yuki strives for and one Hanami seems oddly pained over. It's not long before the two fall in love, and subsequently Yuki believes in Hanami's desire for kindness and comes out to her as intersex. Expectedly, she accepts it with open arms, and the two enjoy a long time of loving, accepting sex in a healthy relationship, until Hanami realizes something one day. She's happy, something she shouldn't be allowed to be because all she deserves is punishment. It's right after this breakdown that Yuki consoles her, and we realize why Hanami seemed so troubled from the very start. Back when she was at an all-girls school, she joined in on group bullying of one particular girl, not even seeming to understand how much harm she was causing her. It wasn't until it reached its peak, with two of the girls assaulting the innocent girl, that she started to realize how cruel all of it was, with the main perpetrators expelled soon after. But not her, she was left behind. She attempted again and again to talk to the girl to try and reconcile with her, completely blind to how much she helped traumatize her, until one day, under the weight of all the bullying, the girl killed herself and left Hanami a message cursing her. It was from that incident which Hanami decided to strive for pacifism so no one else could be hurt, but she still really truly believes she needs punishment even if no one else does, and she doesn't see anyone who can give it to her but Yuki. If it's not already clear, Hanami's root is about guilt and retribution, to what extent it needs to be taken for one to atone, and the brutality that follows if we're to take it to its core. It's the system which most criminal justice systems from the US to Japan are built on, and subsequently what most popular beliefs of justice are built on, regardless of pushback from activists seeking ones which aim for restoration and to hold structures as accountable as abusers. There's no denying at all that what Hanami did with the other kids was awful, but the fact that something like that was able to happen speaks volumes about how little the school faculty gave a shit about anyone there, something which is unfortunately incredibly common with how little teachers are paid and how poorly schools can be staffed. It's a situation where what powers the institutions failed the institutions, and those institutions failed all of the students as much as they failed themselves and each other for engaging in horrible, inexcusably cruel behavior. The greatest offenders certainly deserved being expelled, though as shown in the fan disc, they were of course never given the resources to become better people, and one in fact grew much worse. But what about Hanami? There's a lot of complications with her that don't exist in the cut and dry case of malicious, horrible abuse the other students committed. Hanami legitimately seemed to believe in the other classmates describing the bullying as play and joined in as such. It should have been obvious to her what she did was awful, but she wasn't even fully cognizant of that horribleness. So what punishment does that warrant? By an extreme retributive standpoint, committing the sin at all, regardless of will, deserves full punishment and nothing else. And as someone who believes in this, Hanami fully embraces a self-destructive masochism that leads to her very core being shattered, and eventually her being stabbed to death at the hands of Yuki, dying with a smile on her face, freed from her sins. To be completely sympathetic, I get exactly why someone would go to this extent. The mixture of that view plus Hanami's lack of punishment left her with an irreconcilable sense of guilt that I've frankly seen all too much in people who have hurt others in the past, which includes myself. I can say with utmost certainty I was not a very good kid sometimes. As a teen, I lied to others constantly, I did countless things I shouldn't have, shy of anything illegal, and I was always looking out for myself more than anything. However, just like how Hanami was failed by an apathetic school, I was failed by a lot of systems. I was taken out of the school system and never checked on, I was neglected and emotionally abused by my family, and I was sexually and emotionally manipulated by the few friends I did make online for the longest time. I learned all of my worst behaviors from all of that, and it wasn't until my late teens that I made an effort to change myself for the better, as well as to recognize how I hurt people who had hurt me. I can't say my sins, whatever one might consider them to be, are as grave as Hanami's are. I never really bullied people, for lack of having anyone to bully perhaps, and certainly not to the point of driving anyone to suicide. But I nevertheless felt I deserved something for how I used to be, and when I by chance ended up in a toxic friends with benefits situation that saw me getting constantly sexually manipulated, all of the feelings of pain I had were overridden by a feeling that I deserved to be hurt, among many other complications. But none of that, nor any other ways I allowed myself to be hurt or sought it out, fixed anything I did to others, did it? No amount of punishment I considered giving myself, nor received, did a single thing to help the people I've hurt, nor did it change any of my behavior. The only things that changed my behavior behavior were acceptance from other people for my flaws, not people forgiving them entirely or claiming I'm innocent, but rather actively wanting me to heal. It was being treated like a hurt person that needed help that allowed me to work on myself and come to terms with the fact that I have a lot of problems. That's a tough pill to swallow though, and like everyone else in this cast, Hanami isn't given the chance for such a pill. Her route follows that impulse for self-destruction as punishment, the concept of an eye for an eye to its very core, and shows her dying because of it. She didn't grow or heal as a person because of that self-given retribution, and nothing changed for the girl who she bullied with the others. All it did, like a lot of retributive justice does, is satisfy an urge for atonement. There's something else I want to posit before wrapping up this section, and that's an alternative, or maybe complementary, reading of Hanami's route by Zodi and her blog post about the game from 2017. Reading it partially through a lens of riot girl punk feminism, she posits that Hanami is what people would consider a good girl. She is an apologetic, sweet, and innocent person, as one should be, and such people are also seen as being incapable of wrongdoing. That's at odds with the fact that she contributed, well, to someone's death, and people's refusal to see her as anything but a good girl is dehumanizing. It strips her of her capability as a person to hurt others and be punished for such hurt. Reading it like this, Hanami's route is about a person's right to fail others, to hurt others, to be judged, and to be punished for those, and about the denial of such things as denial of humanity itself. It's a reading I didn't even fully consider as I played through the game, but looking back now feels blindingly obvious, and it's one that I honestly feels go well with my own take on it, because what often goes hand in hand with a belief in retributive justice is a belief in this kind of good-bad person dichotomy. So where does this leave us? Are there ways of viewing people, the world, and justice that don't treat people as plain innocents and abusers? Well, I think so, because as previously mentioned, activists have been trying to come up with ways that are more beneficial for society. Quoting the book The Feminist and the Sex Offender, where the criminal legal system seeks retribution, restorative justice seeks repair. Where players in the system may take only one side, either perpetrators or victims, restorative justice centers the needs of the harmed person yet never loses sight of the harm doer's humanity, or the harm that may have befallen him. Reading Hanami's route, I couldn't help but wonder how things might have been had she not been part of a larger world whose foundational ideas of justice are that of retribution, and who refuses to acknowledge good people as capable of harm. Maybe with the right resources, the victim would have been afforded the opportunity to move past her pain and live. Maybe then Hanami would have been able to apologize if such a thing was wanted, and also heal. And maybe with a school system that actually cared, the other abusers would have been given the resources to be decent people from then on in their lives. That's not the world she, nor we, live in, but it's one that we can strive to build, and we can start by seeing people as people capable of good and bad, growth and recovery. Continuing with the theme of self-destruction, we have the last route of the game, and being the trans girl's route, it's the one that personally hit closest for me. Toboso's route has a lot to dissect in pretty much every regard, but first I need to provide some real-world context as to why the game discusses gender the way it does, because without that and some of the context of previous routes' themes, I think it's a bit easy to read what's talked about here in bad faith ways. Japan was, up until recently and even now to some extent, very slow on the uptake with regards to gender care. It took until 1996 for any sort of formal diagnosis of dysphoria to exist, and that followed the same concept much of the world had been using since the 80s, gender identity disorder. GID is not only a much more strict and pointed concept than dysphoria, which is more broadly in incongruence with the gender one is assigned at birth, but that strictness and pointedness comes from how it rigidly defines gender and sex, male or female, no in-betweens, and a heavy leaning towards the idea that one must desire not to have the genitals they were born with in order to qualify. While a lot of this has been shed within the DSM-5, the first revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders to replace GID of gender dysphoria, not all mental institutions have kept up to date with it, and Japan's is one for a lot of reasons. Despite some cities like Tokyo ruling otherwise on a city level this year, the country still, broadly, requires one to seek surgery to be able to change their gender on a legal level, and a lot of the public still doesn't have a great understanding of how broad of a spectrum transness really is. This is all incredibly important to keep in mind because it's what influences Toboso's mindset. She's from a time where, for many people who weren't trans activists, the only thing they knew about their own struggles was this heavily medicalized, highly binary concept of treatment, gender, and dysphoria. You either want everything a cis woman has, or you're just a cross-dressing man, no matter how much you try otherwise. The route begins with Yuki stumbling into Toboso in the hallway, talking for a bit and deciding to walk home after Toboso takes a brief break to take her hormones. Doing so the following day too, the two then having an earnest conversation about her struggles, being someone diagnosed with GID who wishes to be a woman, yet not able to reconcile every aspect of herself with that. Though not trans herself, herself, Yuki is able to empathize a lot with her feelings due to her own condition, leading the two to eventually confess to each other mutually and Yuki to reveal herself. Rather than be disgusted by it, Toboso is not just happy, but jealous. To her, Yuki is incredibly lucky, being able to both be a woman by way of having the right genitals, yet still having a penis as well. It's because of that admiration that Yuki is able to feel proud of her body, and Toboso, for a moment, is able to feel like a woman, giving service to Yuki like she imagines one would and proudly referring to herself as one. That kind of loving, mutual fulfillment reaches its climax a few days later when the two abruptly have penetrative sex in the restroom, and Toboso lets all of her feelings spill out. Her happiness at Yuki seeing her and treating her as a woman, her desire to be married, a loving wife who has intercourse every day with a loving partner. But all of that is dampened by an inability to feel like a woman because of her unwillingness to lose her genitals. Not because she fears the pain, but because she can't imagine being without them and giving up the pleasure they bring. It's solely because of that Toboso doesn't believe she could ever truly become a woman. In essence, she's caught between two worlds, and not because of some innate disorder, but because of the binary way that society thinks about gender and sex. All of Toboso's text in the game talking about this comes off to me less as someone who genuinely wants a vagina because it's what would make them most comfortable with their own body, and more so because they cannot imagine a woman existing without one, because, well, that is part of the idea that GID presents. Which, like, I'm sure that's an experience a lot of trans women can relate to, at least I certainly did. Early on in transition, I was often very uncomfortable with having the parts I had because I saw them as invalidating my desire to be a woman. All I'd grown up hearing about trans people were either horrible, hateful stories or the most typical, I was born with a girl's mind, I got everything to be a girl type of stories. And certainly I resonated with those a lot. I've had a pretty strong sense of my gender identity ever since I was made aware that gender identity was a thing, and I've always been drawn to typically girlier things on the grounds of them being for girls. But I never had any shame or confusion over my genitals until I was hit with the idea that girls weren't supposed to have those parts. Only boys could, and I didn't want to be a boy. It was from there that I grew both a respect and a resentment, because on one hand I like having it and how it feels, and I'm not ashamed to say that as someone who otherwise passes as a typical woman in her day-to-day life and wants things like to be a loving wife and get married. But on the other hand, it felt like this part was almost a birth scar, something that I could never truly be rid of, but had to be rid of if I wanted to be a woman. In fact, there was a time where, like Toboso, I really felt it could have been ideal for me to have both, unaware of how unrealistic and purely fictional that is. My point in all of this is that I see a lot of my past self in Toboso's ramblings. While this might come off as a grave misunderstanding of trans identity to someone approaching this all from a modern understanding of dysphoria, as someone familiar of history and trans internet brain rot, this reads to me as quite possibly one of the most deep cuts into how badly the institutionalization and medicalization of gender identity has historically and presently hurt trans people in immeasurable ways. Even more than that, the rigid ideas that this medicalization is based on are harmful to everybody. Toboso believes in what a lot of society, from religious fundamentalists to TERFs to trans medicalist communities, believes, at least in part. Women must have estrogen in their systems, wombs to give birth with, and vaginas as genitals. Women are not women unless they have a hole, and therefore Toboso believes she cannot be a woman. It's this belief which tears her apart during a long session alone in her bedroom, pleasuring herself under the effects of an aphrodisiac and slipping between more masculine and feminine parts of her mind. Described by herself as an internal battle, one in which she loses to her masculine self as much as she never wishes to. The entire sequence is one of the most powerful and explicit reflections I've seen on the complications of trans sexuality, and I guess it's also erotic if you're into trans girls gooning. It also ends in an unexpectedly brutal way. Hopeless and distraught over everything, firmly believing there is no longer any chance for her to be a woman, and firmly entrenched in the predominant medicalist view of gender identity, Toboso takes one last stab at things. Literally, as she injects a powerful numbing agent into herself to be able to carve a vagina into herself, or at least some facsimile of one, and presents herself to Yuki later that night. Her concern over her health and safety is soon overtaken by Toboso seeming insistent at trying it out, and enjoys that both of them find finally having sex this way. Toboso, by having a hole between her legs, feels like she's finally qualified to be a woman, and so keeps taking it steps further and further. She carves a hole into where her womb would be so Yuki can try and impregnate her, and finally she carves a hole that no other woman can claim to have, one into her head. The two drawn in pleasure together until the drug wears off and Toboso begins to die, feeling like a woman, and that alone is enough for her to pass away smiling. The absurdity of the lengths that Toboso goes, I feel, do a very good and even darkly comedic job at highlighting how absurd trying to define womanhood could get. Because defining it requires creating criteria, and even the biology that bigots love to rely on often disproves those criteria. The TERFs will say that you need specific chromosomes in a womb and a vagina to be one, but then plenty of otherwise typical women are born with abnormal chromosomes or without a womb. Are they any less women? Or say one defines women based on if they meet certain visible requirements, if they pass or not. People love to say they can always tell when someone is trans, and then completely fail at telling if people are trans because all supposed trans traits pop up in cis women all of the time. It's all laughably absurd pseudoscience. However, creating those definitions also provides some sense of logic and rigidity, and following that, a sense of security. Those things are incredibly important to anyone, but I think doubly so for those who have lived their lives without being afforded security in their own identity and even bodies, thanks to institutions that admire such rigidity. It's one of the many reasons that some people, even trans people now, live by rigid definitions of past DSMs and of certain ideologies, despite them hurting everyone. Toboso, being of a time where one couldn't help but be burdened by those definitions, subsequently finds herself being broken by them. She can't find any security in her identity as a woman and goes to absurd lengths to try and create security. She carves a hole between her legs for a semblance of the right genital. She creates a hole where a womb would be. She gorges her eye out for a hole. She has her ear used as a hole for sex and creates a hole in her skull, because if women are defined by that hole they have, then 5 of them makes her even more women, right? Obviously, no one in even the most extremist gender essentialist movement believes that skull fucking or tummy fucking is part of being a woman. But that's exactly it. Defining women, or fuck it, any sex or gender by their ability to have certain things on or in their body is an endless rabbit hole that causes endless debates even within radical circles. Back when I was searching for any strict idea of what a woman was, I saw countless threads in trans medicalist circles where people would argue just how far one had to go to be a woman and what would qualify. After a while, all of it just started to seem absurd to me. Ideas that checked out with ideas of what women were in my head at a first glance crumbled the moment I looked any deeper, much the way Toboso's absurd extrapolations do. No matter how far I searched, I could never find that elusive, immutable definition of a woman, and searching for it only hurt me more and more until I finally decided enough was enough. On top of all that, I think there's a case to be made for these last segments of the route being commentary on the desperation for comfort trans people experience when good care and support isn't accessible. Toboso was literally willing to gorge her body for some semblance of comfort, which may sound absurd, but if you look back into history, trans people have done some pretty painful things just to feel any sense of comfort. Taking all of this into account, I think Toboso's route can be seen as making a pretty radical statement for a piece of media from 2014. Gender and sex are absurd, undefinable boundaries, and attempting to define them leads to people destroying themselves in search of peace with society rather than peace with themselves. Had Toboso not been burdened by overly medical and strict definitions of both dysphoria and gender, she very well could have lived a happy life as a trans woman who never sought bottom surgery. Someone who could accept that having a cock doesn't make you less of a woman. Whatever the hell that even is. But that's not the society she lives in, and it's frankly not even the one that we live in now. Trans communities still fight over what exactly constitutes being properly trans, rather than accepting that gender as a concept is kind of nebulous and weird and stupid. I can't claim to be above it, of course, and I don't think many people can. I recognize that Western conceptions of gender are fleeting and undefinable, but I feel proud and secure in my identity as a woman, and I feel happy being seen as one. Gender is really an inescapable societal institution that everyone within the industrialized world has been forced to face and submit to. Nevertheless, we can at least attempt to make gender more bearable by accepting people as they are, making care accessible, and helping people to shed strict notions of it in favor of something more fluid, aware of its undefinability. You can still find stability in gender even if you know gender is unstable. You should not have to appease societal expectations to be who you want to be. You should be able to be yourself without being burdened by them, lest you become so absorbed in them that you destroy yourself in pursuit of peace. Before wrapping this up, I want to briefly touch base with the Yuki route again, because up until this point I haven't really given it attention. But now with the full context of the game established, I think the purpose of it, as well as the mechanisms behind it, become very clear. Yuki is someone desperate for people to accept her and will go to any length to find a world in which she can be accepted, as well as being willing to mold herself to suit what other people want. If she has to be a bottom, then she will. If she has to be a boy, then she will. So on and so on. Similarly, also because of her own traumas and rejection, she's completely willing to encourage the worst parts of the people which will both ruin them and her. In Alice's route, that's accepting cruel, narcissistic possessiveness as love. In Somari's route, that's accepting her abuse and bowing to her ideology. In Hanami's route, that's being willing to wound her until death to free a guilty conscience. In Toboso's route, that's actively indulging her self-destructive concepts of what a woman is. And it's in her route that we see this taken to an extreme. Yuki destroys everything in an attempt to create a world of a lover that will accept her, for everyone and everything else in her life has rejected her. In her root, we see her as a monster, not because of her intersexuality or her frankly misdiagnosed identity disorder, but because of society's bigotry and scorn for people merely for being different. She is someone who was bullied and destroyed until they themselves sought peace and destruction. Given all of these complex themes that I've mentioned and how dense each root is with concepts, you might be expecting Dasaku's true ending to be some massive, revelatory segment that perfectly ties everything together. And while it does tie everything together, it does so in a way that feels very Dasaku in the best way possible. After you've seen every route, you can replay the Stalker Yuki route again, this time with an extra scene appended, showing the entire group having an orgy. Except this isn't the group of friends we saw in the intro, nor are they in the state we saw them last during this entire route. It's them broken, battered, and barely holding together in their most pulverized states from the end of each of their individual paths. What makes this scene amusing and darkly comedic rather than morbid and horrifying is that all of them maintain the same level of peace and acceptance they achieved at the end of each route. Toboso truly believes herself to be a girl even as she's penetrating Alice. Alice seems at peace with her mental issues, enjoying the attention everyone is giving her. Hanami seems to be in bliss, freed of her sins and enjoying her masochistic sex. And Somari seems to have accepted herself as being a cruel, sadistic person, hiding under no mask anymore. These are people who have embraced that they are flawed people. It's truly a world of pure white where they can be together forever. To paraphrase the ending dialogue, one of people far separated from normalcy, people who are defective and unsightly, people who are Dasaku. Trash, bakemono, monsters. They are people of kin who can form deep bonds because they understand what it means to be outcasts, and that is beautiful. But these five are not the only ones, for the world is full of people who are seen by society as defective, broken, damaged, rejected, cast aside, and regardless of what society says about them, the world is still full of love for them. And I think that's what Dasaku is ultimately about, and why I think the game is so brilliant for being a story willing to show people at their absolute worst, indulging in their worst without a single hope of improving within the story. The entire point of the game is that you, nor anyone else, needs to be a normal or functioning human to have the right to exist. And as the fandis points out, who knows if normal people even exist? The world is full of love for even the most broken of us at our worst times, and we do not need to do anything more than be our broken selves to qualify for that love. Now, granted, the game is not saying that you should do nothing to improve yourself. While not stated directly in the text, I think it's clear from the way that each character following their flaws and impulses to their most extreme leads to death and grave wounding shows well enough that living in these ways can destroy you. However, that improvement is not a prerequisite for you to have a right to exist, to find happiness, to find love, because everyone can find that at any time. And similarly, we can all work on ourselves for the sake of not just our well-being, but that of others. We can recognize our invisible flaws, we can leave our hateful ideologies, we can absolve ourselves of our guilt, we can escape from our rigid ideas of identity, but even within those we are still humans. Accepting our flaws is human. And maybe sometimes we're bad humans. Maybe sometimes we're self-destructive humans. Maybe sometimes we're unsightly humans. Maybe sometimes we're broken humans. Maybe sometimes we're rejected by other humans who tried to hide their flaws. But no matter what, no matter where you are in life, you are still human. You are not alone in your flaws, and you are not below happiness and recovery. Ultimately, Dasaku is one of the most bizarre, over-the-top, hyper-violent, and hyper-sexual works I've experienced, and I love it for that. It's one of the most indicative of not just the queer experience I've seen, but the experience of being a flawed, messy person who lives on the boundaries of a society full of people trying very desperately to pretend they also do not have flaws. Because of all this, it's certainly one that has a limited audience. I think anyone can pick it up and get something out of it, but so much of its themes and contents feels deeply rooted in the specific kinds of brainworms that people who have lived through trauma, judgment, and overwhelming failure have, that I don't know how much it will ring fully for those who aren't themselves that, or aren't willing to open their mind to something so visceral. But what I do know, as a traumatized, formerly bad-behaving, still awkward mess of an adult trans woman who loves weird, bloody, gory art, Dasaku is a title that struck a chord that no other fiction I've read has. It indulges in all its absurdity and bluntness in ways that capture my worst feelings and experiences like nothing else, and spits them back out with clarity so vivid that I can't help but acknowledge them and realize my own biases and failings. If you want to play the game, then the good news is that it's incredibly accessible as long as you know Japanese. The 16.9 release is available on basically every major digital adult game distributor in Japan for 5,000 yen, roughly $30 at the time of writing this, and even includes the fan disc. Box copies also go for about that much, significantly lower if you go for the original for free release, so even die-hard physical collectors can get in on the fun? Question mark? Regardless of however you choose to play it, or even if you're holding out for some sort of future English translation, Dasaku is for sure one of the most memorable eroge I've ever played, and one that I'm going to hold dear for a long time as a peak example of messy queer art. It is wild, unhinged, absurd, and it's got one hell of a simple yet profound message. That no matter what you're struggling with, and no matter how good or bad you may be, it is okay to accept your flaws. The world is full of Dasaku like us. So remember, no matter how trash you are, you're still a person.